founder of one of the DNA sequencing companies, Stan Lapidus. You've got George Church himself. You've got the Chief Information Officer for one of the major Harvard hospitals. You've got Esther Dyson, who, if any of you know Freeman Dyson, Esther is herself a famous figure in Silicon Valley. I can't remember all the other folks who are part of the PGP10. It's a really, really interesting group of people, all of whom have participated in what is a combination of a social experiment of making information about themselves and data about their genomes publicly available, and also what happens in the world when you do this. So that's happened. That all happened very suddenly. Notice, all those announcements happened in November of 2007. What does the world do? Well, partly what happens is people start going to spit parties and contributing stuff and sending their samples off to these companies. 23andMe incidentally charges, I think, $400. It may have come down to $250. I don't know. I haven't checked lately. Navigenics, $2,500. And again, DecodeMe is $985. And then we have the Cadillac of all this is Nomi, or Gnome, depending on who you talk to. And that's the several $100,000 to get your whole genome at full sequence level. Well, it turns out that 2 states in the United States have laws about genetic testing. We do not have a federal law in the United States about genetic testing. It's largely unregulated unless you give a genetic test that goes through a mathematical black box and produces an answer. And then the FDA will regulate it as of last year. But for most of the stuff we're talking about here, it's largely unregulated, but there are 2 states, New York and California, that have laws about genetic testing. So they saw this was going on, and they sent letters to the companies and said, stop doing that. This is a genetic test. By the definitions on our statutes, this is a genetic test. You got to stop doing that. And in fact, if you look at the definition of a genetic test in their statutes, what these companies are doing is a genetic test. There was a lot of confusion about what to do about this. All of these companies have gone back on the market, so whatever negotiations they had with these 2 states, they are back on the market. And I won't go into the details of how that's all worked out. I don't think the end of that story has happened yet. But here's what I'm going to observe. Those laws were passed in reaction to the human genetics that I talked about before, where we thought we were going to discover genetic tests. What that meant was we're going to find a test that tells you the risk of a very specific disease. And we're thinking breast cancer, cystic fibrosis, sickle cell, things that we have kind of gotten used to, Huntington's disease. And that's what we mean by genetic testing. But now we're applying that framework to what is in essence a consumer service for scanning your entire genome. And it's not a completely, there are as many disanalogies as there are analogies. So what is the model of genetic testing that we grew up under in the 1990s? It was really the original template for this was Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease was the very first disease whose inheritance was mapped to a particular chromosome. It was chromosome 4. That happened in 1983. It took a full decade to find the very specific mutation that was associated with Huntington's disease. But during that decade, we evolved a way of doing genetic tests for Huntington's disease that then became the template for Alzheimer's disease and cancer genetic testing, which was, before you take this test, know that it's a serious business. You have to get counseled. You then get the test, and then you go back to somebody who helps explain what the results mean. It's a rather elaborate process. It bundled getting the genetic test to the physician services and the genetic counseling services. And it was all concerned about the safety of and the psychological well-being of the person being tested. It's a kind of elaborate system if you think about it. It involves an intermediary who's in medicine. The bundling of those services for testing with the services for interpreting the testing. And what you're worried about is how are people going to interpret this? Are they going to make crazy decisions? Are they going to commit suicide? There was serious concern about suicide, particularly in the Huntington's families. And it's actually not a false concern in these families. There is a higher risk of suicide in Huntington's families. But now, let's think about it. We've got some things where we can kind of agree, yeah, this really does feel like that old Mendelian genetics broken gene. We know what's going on. Those I've put in red here. But there is a spectrum that has now come into being with the advent of all these new technologies. And I've been using this slide now for about 6 months to a year, and it turns out every time I do a talk, I just did this today, I have to add something new to it, because somebody is doing something in the real world that they weren't doing a few weeks ago or a month ago. About 2 months ago, Decode started offering a test that isn't like the BRCA test, where you're in a family and you've either gotten this susceptibility gene or you haven't. They are now scanning the genome and they're saying, well, here are 4 or 5 genetic variations that your odds are higher or lower than average of getting breast cancer because you've got these markers. So it's not a predictive test, and it doesn't say you're in one of these high-risk families. It's a softer kind of prediction. And then just a few weeks ago, 23andMe did something rather audacious. They actually, for a long time, they were doing that same kind of risk prediction stuff for many, many different kinds of conditions. But they announced that they were going to start testing for 3 of the most common mutations that are associated with breast cancers in these BRCA families. So they are offering this as part, you can get this from them as part of their consumer genetic testing service. I'll come back to that in a minute, but is that medical or isn't it? Are you going to go have a bilateral mastectomy and oophorectomy based on your 23andMe test? Absolutely not. You're going to get that verified in a real lab before you do that. But are you going to know that you should have that based on a consumer genetic test? Well, might be. So it could be that the people that get positive results here are going to go to Myriad Genetics and get a clinical genetic test. And if that comes back positive, then they might do that clinical decision to have their breasts and ovaries taken out. So even before those events happened, we do have other kinds of genetic testing. ApoE is my favorite. It's the one that's really complicated. It's right on the shade between whether it's predictive or whether it's a purely medical test. This is the risk of getting late onset Alzheimer's disease, the kind of common flavor of Alzheimer's disease. And if you have the E4 allele of Alzheimer's disease, you're at about 3 or 4-fold higher risk of getting Alzheimer's disease than average. If you've got 2 copies of that, both of your copies of that allele are E4. If you're a male, my age, your risk goes up by a factor of 15 or so. So it's a very high risk of getting Alzheimer's disease before you die, if you've got that. So that's not really a genetic test like we were talking about that's Mendelian, but it's a pretty interesting test, and it tells you a lot of information about your risk if you happen to have that allele. And that allele is not uncommon, about 15% of the population. And we also have all these other tests out there for assessing overall genetic risk. Those, I call that GWAS, that stands for genome-wide association studies. This is where you scan a whole genome and look for the things that are predicting risk for various disorders based on the hundreds of studies that have been going on for the last 3 or 4 years using these chip technologies on common human variations. In parallel to this, we now have lots of companies out there doing ancestry testing. Some of them focus on African ancestry, some of them are ancestry in general, but there are a lot of these companies that are springing up. And then we have these companies that some journalists are calling recreational genomics. The companies themselves hate that term and reject that term. And I think what the journalists are searching for is a term that is people